this parsha is rich in symbolism. It describes the life of Yaakov. It begins with the words VaYechi, Yaakov Eretz Yisrael. Yaakov lived in the land of Mitzrayim 147 years. Yimei Yaakov Shnei Chayav Sheva Shanim V'Arba'im Umas Shana, 147 years. So the Baal HaTurim points out that in the case of the other patriarchs, the Torah mentions the years, the hundreds initially, and then the tens, and then the units. So Abraham lived to the age of 175, and Yitzchak lived to the age of 180, and the Torah mentions the hundreds before the tens and the units. Here in the case of Yaakov, it says that Yaakov lived 7 years and 40 years and 100 years. So the Torah sort of alludes or prioritizes the paucity of his life, of the years of his life, by starting with the 7 and then the 40 and then the 100. The remez here, of course, is that Yaakov's father before him. So in particular, and we'll more about that, but the Bam says about the word VaYechi, the gematria of VaYechi is 34. VaYechi Yaakov is 34 years. Again, having mentioned the difficulty of his years and the tempestuous nature of his life, the tumultuous times that he endured, so there's a remez, an important remez here in the number 34, because Yaakov lived with Yosef 17 years at the beginning of the life of Yosef until he was sold into slavery, and 17 years at the end of his life, 17 years at the end of the life of Yaakov when he was reunited with Yosef, and he lived 17 contented years in Mitzrayim at that time. That his life, other than that, than those years, those were the best years of his life, so to speak. About the life of Yosef, we can certainly understand that. He married Leah when he really wanted to marry Rachel. Leah had one child after another, which I'm sure was a source of joy for Yaakov, but his beloved wife Rachel was childless. They had some difficult times and difficult dialogue as a result. Finally, when Yosef was born, so Yosef became Yaakov's favorite son. So he had 17. Then after that, the difficult, painful years. But if we think about the life of Yaakov, how much turbulence did he experience? The encounter with Esav, the encounter with Lavan, the difficulties with Dinah in Shechem, and so many events in his life, so that we can understand that when the Torah says he had 34 years of joy, years of contentment, there's a certain poignancy which I think we can relate to. We'll see further about that idea as well. Baal HaTurim adds on that the 17 years that Yaakov lived in Eretz Mitzrayim, 17 years in Egypt, correspond to the 17 of the early life of Yosef in another way as well, namely that in the merit of Yaakov's provision for Yosef for 17 years, Yaakov in turn was the guest of the crown, and he and his family were maintained by Yosef and his household in royal fashion, so that the 17 years at the end of Yaakov's life was as a hero because he's the father of the great Yosef, who was in turn the hero of Mitzrayim. That corresponds to the 17 years in which Yaakov raised Yosef initially. There's an insight here which I heard in yeshiva many, many years ago, which has always remained with me. The Balei Musar explained that we often take for granted the care that parents provide for a child from his infancy through pre-adolescence and then as a teenager until he's able to make his own way in life. And to a certain degree, I'm sure that is natural and that is to be expected. And parents who neglect their child are rightly condemned. But nevertheless, it doesn't mean that one should ever take for granted the chesed and the benefit that is that a child receives from his parents, so much so that haTurim says the 17 years in which Yaakov cared for Yosef in his childhood until he was taken from him correspond to the 17 years at the end of the life of Yaakov. The obligation of Hakaras Satov, the obligation of Kibbut Aveim, of honoring one's parents and appreciating what they have done for him, is not diminished only because it's parents to care for their children in the early stages of their lives. And we were in South Africa recently. We had the opportunity to spend time with our son Simcha and his wife, who we greatly love as well, and their children, our grandchildren. And we had that sense of continuity and the care that we invested in our children. I don't mean to say in terms of the nachas that we feel of their achievements, but rather just the recognition that there is a sense of responsibility that parents have towards their children, but equally and reciprocally a sense of appreciation that the children should always retain for their parents. I'm only mentioning Simcha and his family because we were with them recently, not to imply that this response he has been neglected in any way. The punchline, though, that I would like to suggest, at least from what I can see in this opening passage, is something that haTurim adds about the fact that Yaakov lived to the age of 147, but it was less than the 180 years of his life, Yitzchak. In particular, he lived 3 years less. So haTurim quotes a pasuk in Mishlei, Kilas chinam lo savo, that a curse which is, so I just want to find the language here, Kilas chinam lo savo, that a curse which is vain, which is without validity, will not come about, lo savo. But there is a nuance there in that pasuk which haTurim alludes to. The pasuk is written, the sorry, the pasuk is written with a lamed vav, lo savo, that it will not come to pass. But the ksiv, the way that it's pronounced, is lo savo with vav. Just to clarify, the words in Hebrew lo and lo are pronounced exactly the same, but their meaning can be different depending on the spelling. You have examples of that in English language, probably other languages as well. So lo with an aleph means it will not happen. Lo with a vav means it will happen to him. So the pasuk says in the ksiv, the way it's written, it says lo savo, that a curse without cause will not come to pass. That's the way it's written in the text of the book of Mishlei. But the way that it is pronounced, that is to say, there is a drash that can be understood as if it's written with a vav. That means it will come to the one who has uttered the curse. So based on that, the haTurim says that we have here a remez, because when Yaakov, he a curse on one occasion. He uttered a curse when he said, "Im asher timtza elecha lo yichyeh," in Parshas Toldos. No, in Parshas VaYechi, at the end of Parshas VaYechi, when Yaakov fled the household of Lavan with his wives and his children and his livestock and all the members of his household. When they fled, Rachel took the teraphim of her father. It's not clear exactly what these teraphim were, if they were objects of divination, if they were a form of idolatry in their own right. It's not exactly clear. But Rachel evidently wanted to distance her father from such behavior, although her motivation is not very clear. The Torah doesn't really spell it out. But in any case, Yaakov did not know that she took them. When Lavan pursued Yaakov and ultimately caught up with him, Lavan, rebuked Yaakov for a number of things, and he also said, "Why did you steal my gods?" Again, whether they were actually idols or something similar is unclear. And Yaakov said, not knowing that anyone had taken them, he said, "Im asher timtzas elehecha lo yichya." The one in whose possession you find them shall not live. Way that it has nothing to do with me, and I have no responsibility for it. But of course, what he actually said was, the one in whose possession you find it shall die. And of course, that's exactly what happened to Rachel, that she did die shortly thereafter. She died in childbirth. And whether Yaakov ever learned about the fact that she had taken them or not, again, the Torah does not say. But the word yichye, lo yichye, has the gematria of 33. So says the Baal haTurim that Yaakov lived in Mitzrayim and he died at the age of 147, which was 33 years younger than the death of his father. And the reason for that, says the Baal HaTurim here, is that years earlier, Yaakov had uttered the faithful words, Im asher yim timtzas elehecha lo yichya. And understanding, that is to say, because he said it, Rachel did indeed die a short while later. But the pasuk in Mishlei indicates that a curse which is without any validity will not come to pass, but rather it will, according to the Remez, come to pass against the one who uttered the curse. And that's what happened here, that Yaakov died 33 years earlier, 33 years younger than Yitzchak. So this is all the Baal HaTurim says about that number 33 in our Parsha. And actually, he doesn't speak about it further in last week's Parsha either. But there is a medrash which I want to share with you. The medrash says that according to Chazal, as we mentioned earlier, the Avos were expected, their allocated years were 180 years. Yitzchak lived to the age of 180. Avraham, it seems, also would have lived to 180, but he died at the age of 175. And the reason is, Rashi says in Parshas Toldos, that when Esav came home from the field and he was hungry and he was tired, he was ravenously hungry perhaps, and he said to Yaakov, "Give me ha'itein min ha'adam hazeh. Give me some of this red stuff." So Rashi explains, why was Yaakov preparing Nazid Adashim? What was he busy with preparing that particular type of food? So Rashi says that it was the Sudas Havra, that his father Yitzchak, or their father Yitzchak, had just sustained the death of his father Avraham, and Yaakov was preparing the food known as the Sudas Havra, and it was customary, perhaps it is still customary, that an Avel Aleinu, the first meal that he eats is of lentils, because lentils are round and it symbolizes the cycle of life. So in that pasuk, Rashi says that Avraham would have lived to 180, but since Hashem had told Avraham, "You will die b'seva tova," your end will be peaceful, and your sense of achievement and your sense of satisfaction at your life will be complete. So because Hashem had promised him that, so if Avraham had lived to see the wayward manner of Esav, so Avraham would have been greatly distressed, inevitably. So therefore, says Rashi, Hashem determined that Avraham should expire at the age of 175 so that he would not uh, live to see the wayward manners of Esav, who on that day had committed various transgressions, and therefore we have the figure of 180 as sort of the default age for the Avos. Yaakov died at the age of 147, 33 years less than Avram, as we just mentioned. In last week's Parshas VaYigash, the Torah possibly, according to Chazal, to the reason that Yaakov died so much younger than his father. Take a look uh, in Parshas VaYigash. If you're with me in the Art Scrolls Chumash, it's on page 264. At the top of the page, Pasuk Ches, Vayomer Paro El Yaakov, Kama Yemei Shnei Chayecha. So Yaakov, I should say, Yosef introduced his father Yaakov to Paro to have an audience with, he arranged the audience between the two important personalities. So the Torah interestingly says that when they had this interaction, Paro asked Yaakov, "How old are you?" It's a bit surprising. He didn't say, or at least the Torah does not record that he asked him anything more substantive or anything, or perhaps gracious or philosophical. The conversation that the Torah records just refers to Paro's question, "How old are you?" And the Torah says, by way of reply, "V'yomar Yaakov el Paro yemei shnei migurai shloshim u'ma'as shana." I have lived for 130 years, because again, this is when Yaakov first arrived in Mitzrayim. He said, I'm 130 years old. Only in more years, and pass away at the age of 147. But he adds on then, Ma'at v'ra'im hayu yemei shnei chayai, v'lo hisigus yemei shnei chayei avosai b'yemei megureihem. Yaakov provides a rather elaborate, you might say, excessively elaborate response. The days of the years of my sojourns have been 130 years. Few and bad and have been the days of the years of my life, and they have not reached the lifespans of my forefathers in the days of their sojourns. Now, you may find this response on the part of Yaakov to be a bit surprising and almost like lacking in grace. Paro says, "How old are you?" Yaakov could have just said, "I'm 130 years old." But he adds on, he says, Ma'at v'ra'im, I've not reached the span of my fathers in the days of their sojourns. It wasn't really necessary. It wouldn't seem for Yaakov to have elaborated in that way. And if you feel that way, then I can tell you that the Chachamim say something quite similar as well. The Medrash says that actually Yaakov's response was unworthy, and because of his elaborate response, almost complaining about his time on earth. So he was punished. And because of the 33 words in this dialogue, so 33 years were diminished from his life. The Chazal actually say, in the Medrash, it says that Hashem says to Yaakov, I have saved you from Esav, I have saved you from Lavan, I have saved you from so much peril, from so many vicissitudes. I've restored Dinah to you. I've restored Yosef to you. I've restored Shimon to you as well. It's also taken for a period of time. And I have done all of this for you for my whether for love of Yaakov, I'm sure that was part of it, but whatever the motivation, so to speak, from Hashem's point of view, from Yaakov's point of view, he should have been appreciative. And you're complaining about your life. So he says that the Medrash says, as a result, your life will indeed be foreshortened by 33 years. This is the Medrash. I think the Das Zaken Balitosfos quotes it, but the great Rav Chaim Shmulevitz adds on something further as well. Rav Chaim Shmulevitz was the great Rosh Yeshiva of Mir, uh, in the middle years of the last century. I think he died in 1978, if I recall. I was at the Levaya, in fact. Chaim Shmulevitz says the following: if you take out your Chumash, which perhaps you have in front of you already, and you take a look at Pasuk Tes, which is the response, Vayomer Yaakov el Paro Yemei Shnei Mugurai Shloshim Shana, etc., you'll find that the 33 words that the sages refer to include also the previous pasuk, the question of Paro. In other words, in order for this observation to have any validity, that the 33 words correspond to the 33 years by which Yaakov's life was diminished, it's only accurate if you also include the question that Paro asked as well. Vayomer Paro el Yaakov, kama yemei shnei chayecha. In which case, it would seem a bit unfair. If Chazal criticized Yaakov for complaining about his life, so that's one thing. But how can Yaakov also be held accountable for the question that Paro asked him? How is it like fair for Yaakov's life to be diminished in accordance with the words of his reply when the reckoning includes also the question that Paro asked him in the first place? This is the question that Rav Chaim Shmulevitz asks, and he answers as follows, a very important principle. If you take a look closely at Pasuk Ches, Vayomer Paro el Yaakov, Paro said to Yaakov, Kama yimei shnei chayecha. That is the not on the word kama. Kama, it's almost an exclamation. It stands by itself. It's like almost an involuntary or instinctive response to a situation which is surprising or maybe astonishing. Kama yimei shnei chayecha. It's almost as if Paro perhaps was intending to discuss something else with Yaakov, and maybe he did. Perhaps the Torah doesn't record the entirety of the conversation. But that which the Torah records is Paro's immediate question, how old are you? Says Rav Chaim Shmulevitz, the implication here is that Yaakov looked old beyond his years. Now, of course, it's true that nowadays, for a person to live to 147 probably exceeds any kind of realistic life expectancy in the current era. Perhaps that will change in the future. But in biblical times, as we know from the record that the Torah describes in many different places regarding many different people, they lived much longer. Now, it's true that the early generations of mankind, they lived 700, 800, 900 years. After the flood, the lifespans were greatly diminished. But we still find, as I just mentioned, that Abraham lived to 175 and Yitzhak lived to 180. So therefore, 147, or at the time of this meeting, 130, perhaps was not exceptional at all. But meaning he was not exceptionally old. And as we know, he lived another 17 years, and he perhaps might have otherwise lived another 50 years. But it seems, says Rav Chaim Shmulevitz, that Yaakov's appearance was of a very elderly man. It says that the Rosh Yeshiva of Chaim. From here we see that a person has a responsibility even for the way that he is, for his appearance. I don't just mean how he dresses, his sartorial habits, but the appearance on his face, the appearance, whether he goes through life with a smile, with joy, with contentment, with appreciating the good things in life, or if he has an appearance of someone who is haggard, someone who is depressed, someone who is weighed down with the weight of misfortune. Of course, people do experience misfortune, sometimes terrible misfortune, lo aleinu v'lo aleichem. But a great man or a great woman, no doubt, will rise above it and he'll keep his troubles in his heart. Like it says in Chovos Halvavos, Chasid sahalaso bifanav v'da'agaso belibo. A righteous person, his joy, his exuberance will be on his face, and his uh, troubles, his worry will be in his heart. He'll keep his worries to himself unless there's some productive and valuable reason him. But for a person to wear his troubles on his face, this is something which a tzaddik, a righteous person, will not do. And therefore, indeed, Yaakov was held accountable even for the fact that his appearance evoked the question on the part of Paro. If Yaakov had been, uh, how can I put it, greater tzaddik, or if Yaakov's righteousness were more absolute, he would have able to, despite the vicissitudes of his life, present an appearance of contentment and of joy and of satisfaction. And therefore, he is held accountable for the question of Paro, as well as his response, which, as I said, as you can see for yourself, seems to needlessly highlight the fact that I haven't lived as long as my fathers have lived in their times before me. Here we see the power of speech, and that Yaakov said previously about Rachel, without knowing, of course, that it was Rachel, whoever stole him shall die. The power of speech, and she did, in fact, die shortly thereafter, but it came back to haunt Yaakov in his own life as well, according to the Baal haTurim, the 33 years, lo yechiyeh, gematria 33, he died 33 years before his at an earlier age than his father Yitzchak, and to what the Chaim Shulevitz teaches us from last week's Parsha, when Yaakov was first asked, "How old are you?" and he responded in that sort of self-pitying way that he indeed was punished at that point for the 33 years, and his life was foreshortened 33 years compared to the life of his father Yitzchak before him. Okay, we up here. We've reached our time. I apologize that my delivery, etc., has been a bit weak today. I'm not at the top of my game. Just came back from abroad, and I must have picked up a virus or something along the way. So apologize for that. But anyway, hope everyone has a wonderful Shabbos. If you join us at Kesher, we're doing a Dvar Torah after the Kiddush on the subject of My Son, the Heartthrob.